Under the feeding stadium line for Friday evening, no one suspected Kirsten what with witnessing its finals. The Norman's fireworks happened. Only the laughter of teenagers echoed into Chris faded away la breath under the lights. Around 9:02 p.m. a resident living near the edge of Fort voices echoed Vertov Citrus. Lively conversation. It was very familiar. Has stood still for a few seconds. Then the sounds. Not because the door closed, because so fascinating. The was is solo it. In town, everything went on as usual. Cars round, porches came on. Parents believed children one way home. Cars no on, all alloy, wetty, at familiar foreshadowed, familiar, silent, as it took 26 years for that silence to begin to crack. In the summer 2014, after long rains and the shifting of virus and not the cross carubis of the roving green re-rule school jacket, find it at the Suda, Stephen B. Time and soil. It in evidence. It surfaced like memory berry torago, taste and skin very all over question. Then Gracie disappear. It was simply held up at the 1942 And from that moment on, the forest began to tell its story.
That town was the kind where everyone thought they knew everything. The streets didn't need maps. The faces were so familiar you could tell who they were just by their gait. Life flowed slowly, steadily, and rarely did anything disrupt the rhythm that had been repeated for generations. Every Friday evening in the fall, the whole town seems to be focused on one spot, the high school's soccer field. Not because everyone loves sports, but because it's where everyone meets. Parents sit close together in the cold metal stands. Their breaths mingle with the crisp air, their hands clutching cups of hot coffee, their eyes fixed on the field, not just to see the score, but to catch a glimpse of their children somewhere in the crowd. The smell of popcorn, grilled sausages, and damp grass mingled together in a unique, familiar way. The cheering horns blared and then faded. The sound of boots hitting the ground, the coach's shouts, the students' laughter and chatter behind the stands. It wasn't a chaotic noise, but a symphony of life, a sound one doesn't notice until it disappears. That night was no different. The sky was clear, no rain. The air was cool, but not yet cold enough to cause concern. The stadium lights cast warm patches of light amidst the gradually spreading darkness. When the game ended, no one was in a hurry. Everyone lingered, discussing a missed play, a controversial decision, or simply asking each other what their plans were for the weekend. For the adults, it was a normal, safe, and reliable evening. For the children, it was a rare moment of freedom. No more classes, no more homework. Just the road home, unfinished stories, and the feeling that the whole town had known them, had protected them since childhood. None of them thought that night would be any different. No one thought this would be the last time the town would see the four boys laughing and talking together under the stadium lights. Everything seemed so familiar, so peaceful, that no one realized that this very ordinariness was what caught people off guard the most. In the crowd leaving the football stadium that night, the four boys didn't stand out in any way that would immediately make an impression. But if you look closely, you'll see why they always stick together. Daniel Mercer, 17, was slightly taller than his peers, with a slow, steady gait. He didn't need to say much. He possessed a calm demeanor that reassured others, as if simply being near him would ensure everything would be all right. At school, Daniel played sports and his academic performance was good enough that no one needed to worry about him. At home, he was the self-disciplined, helpful, and rarely complaining son. The adults in town often said that if anything happened, Daniel would be the first to step forward. Brian Holloway was quite different. 16, quick-witted, and always had something to say. Brian couldn't stand silence. If the group fell silent, he was the first to liven things up. Brian's laughter was recognizable, loud and carefree, the kind of laughter that people tend to remember longer than the words spoken. Lucas Red was also 17, but he often walked a step slower. Not because he was weak, but because he preferred to observe. Lucas spoke little, but when he did, it was usually spot on. His friends were used to Lucas standing slightly behind, listening, then suddenly pointing out a detail that no one else had noticed. He had eyes that always looked a little more closely, as if he were memorizing the world in his own way. Kevin Doyle was the youngest 15. He walked beside them with a hint of undeniable excitement. Kevin always tried to quicken his pace so as not to fall behind. He was proud to be with the older boys, proud to be considered part of the group. The jacket he wore that night was a little too big, the sleeves covering his wrists, but Kevin didn't mind. Just being with them was enough to make him feel a little older. They weren't a group because they were in the same class or on the same team. They were a group because they grew up together. They walked the same paths. They took the same shortcuts. They spent the same aimless afternoons wandering. There was a natural familiarity between them, needing no explanation, no reminder. Who walked ahead? Who walked behind? Who talked the most? Who was silent? It had all become a habit. That night, they stood together laughing, teasing, and talking about trivial things. A test, a missed shot, an uncertain weekend plan. None of them thought about tomorrow in a grand sense. They only thought about going home, about the familiar road ahead. It was those small details, that familiarity, that made the nights seem heartbreakingly ordinary, because there was nothing about those four boys that suggested danger. Just friendship, youth, and the belief that when they were together, nothing could happen. On their way home from the soccer field, the four boys had two choices. One was the main road that wound around town, wide, brightly lit, and safe in the adult sense. But that road was longer. It took almost another half hour, passing familiar turns, past rows of houses with their lights on, and the feeling that their free night was being shortened with each passing minute. The remaining option was the shortcut, a small dirt path cutting straight through the forest, unmarked, without an official name, but everyone knew it. People simply called it the shortcut, as if that name alone was enough to make it harmless. For years, schoolchildren walked it after school. Hunters went into the forest through it. Children ran past it during the day without a second thought. It existed as a part of life, and no one questioned it. For adults, that shortcut always comes with a warning: don't go at night. Take the main road for safety. But for teenagers, that warning fades in the face of familiarity. When you've traveled a road dozens of times without incident, your brain starts to consider it safe. Not because you assess the risk, but because you no longer think about the risk. That night, none of the four boys spoke the decision aloud. It happened naturally. Their feet turned toward the forest before they could discuss it. Not because it was reckless, but because it was convenient. Because they were tired. Because they wanted to get home faster. Because the weather was beautiful, dry, with no rain or wind. Because the moon was bright enough to believe they could see everything they needed to see. Teenagers trust their own experience more than any warning. And their experience with that shortcut is peaceful. Nothing ever happened. There were never any accidents. There was never any reason to turn back and choose the longer route. They walked with the familiar mindset of youth. Young people have time. Being together means safety. No one thought that a few minutes saved could buy something bigger. A shortcut is just a shortcut. And that night, for the four boys, it looked no different than any other time. As they turned off the familiar road and entered the forest, the change occurred so slowly that it was difficult to notice immediately. The town lights behind them hadn't completely gone out. They still filtered through the tree trunks, creating thin streaks of light, enough to convince them that darkness hadn't truly begun. But just a few steps later, the light faded. It didn't disappear suddenly, but dimmed little by little, as if someone were turning down the lights of the whole world. The sounds of traffic faded away. The voices from the football field dissolved into the air. Only the voices of the four boys remained, echoing softly among the trees before quickly being swallowed up. The path narrowed. The soil was compacted underfoot, mixed with small pebbles and tree roots that protruded like low ridges. Dry leaves covered the surface, making the footsteps softer but also slippery. Each step produced a very faint rustling sound, enough to hear each other's footsteps, enough to know that they weren't walking alone. The air in the forest was quite different from the outside. Thicker, a little colder. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves clung to my breath. At times, the wind rustled through the canopy, making the branches and leaves rub against each other, producing very small, not frightening, sounds, but enough to remind me that this was no longer a brightly lit football field. Daniel walked ahead, his steps steady and unhurried. Brian walked and talked, one story after another, as if trying to keep the atmosphere from falling into silence. Lucas slowed down a notch, his eyes fixed on the ground, avoiding the familiar bumps and uneven surfaces. Kevin followed closely, trying to place his feet in the places the man in front had just stepped, believing it to be the safest way. The path sloped gently downwards. Not sharply, not abruptly, just enough for the body to feel the change. Tree roots began to appear more prominently, stretching across the path like low steps. Dry leaves obscured the true shape of the ground, making everything appear flatter than it actually was. Somewhere in the forest, there was the faint sound of an animal running past. Quick, quiet. No one turned around. Those sounds were familiar. They carried no warning. The four boys continued walking, carrying the composure of those who believed they were treading a familiar path. But with each step, the light behind them dimmed a little more. The sounds faded. And the forest, very silently, began to close in around them. There's a section of that trail that looks completely harmless during the day. Flat ground, clear path. Just a stretch of forest that's a little darker than the rest. But at night, that section changes in a way that's very difficult to discern. Ravine lay right beside the trail, unguarded and without signs. The edge of the land wasn't a sheer cliff face. It sloped gently downwards, then suddenly plunged deeper. By day, the steepness was visible to the eye. At night, when dry leaves covered the ground and the shadows of the trees blurred the boundaries, the ground deceived the eye. It looked as if there was still a path, as if just one more step would suffice. Darkness doesn't come like in the movies. It doesn't descend, it creeps in. It diminishes depth, flattening everything. The empty space is no longer just an empty space, but becomes a black expanse seamlessly connected to the ground. And the human brain, when deprived of light, will automatically fill in what it perceives as familiar. The four boys didn't know they were walking right next to a visual trap. No one stopped. No one warned them. There was no reason to. They'd walked this stretch before, during the day, at dusk, even at dusk. But that night was different. The leaves were thicker. The moon was obscured by clouds. The light behind them had vanished completely. Daniel continued walking steadily. Brian slowed his speech, not out of fear, but because the space naturally lowered his voice. Lucas paid more attention to the ground, but even that careful attention was limited to what his eyes could see. Kevin followed closely, as always, confident that the distance between him and the person in front was safe enough. The feeling of unease didn't escalate into a clear fear. It was just a very subtle change. The air was quieter. Footsteps sounded clearer. The heart beat a little faster, but no one could name the reason. It was the moment the body realized something was wrong, but the mind hadn't yet grasped the situation. Ravine didn't growl. It didn't make any sound. It just sat there, silently, waiting for a misplaced footstep. And in the darkness of the forest night, the line between the familiar path and the abyss had never been so fragile. Around 9:42 p.m., when the four boys had gone deep enough out of sight of the town lights, their voices still echoed. It was unclear who had spoken the last word. It was unclear what had made them laugh. All that was known was that it was a very ordinary, very childlike laugh, which rose and faded away among the trees. A man living near the edge of the forest heard the sound from his porch. He remembered it clearly because it wasn't frightening. It wasn't a cry for help, not a panic. Just the voices of children on their way home. He stood still for a few seconds, listened, then went back inside. And then, the sound disappeared. It didn't disappear because someone told it to be quiet. It didn't disappear because they turned in a different direction. It faded away the way the forest does, when the distance is far enough, when the trees are dense enough, when the darkness is deep enough to swallow everything. Meanwhile, in the town, everything was going on as usual. A car slowed down at the intersection. A door closed. A television was switched on in the living room. In 4 different houses, parents believed their children were coming home, perhaps a few minutes late, but safe. No one looked at their watch and noticed anything unusual. No one stopped because of a vague feeling. Because in a familiar town, the silence of the forest was not something to worry about. 9 hours and 4 minutes passed like any other. No milestones, no warnings. Just a tiny, easily overlooked moment where the last laugh faded away and the world continued to spin, unaware that it had just crossed the boundary of a story from which there was no turning back. The next morning arrived very gently, as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. Light filtered through the curtains. The alarm clock rang. The aroma of coffee filled the kitchen. The town awoke to the familiar rhythm of a new day. The only difference was that in the 4 different houses, certain sounds were absent. The Daniel Mercer household was the first to sense the disharmony. His parents glanced at the clock, thinking Daniel might be sleeping over at a friend's house, nothing unusual. They called him upstairs, then paused, telling themselves that their 17-year-old son needed his own space. Their anxiety was still far from over, held back by the belief that everything would eventually work itself out. At Brian Holloway's house, his mother went up the stairs twice. She looked around the familiar room, searching for signs that Brian had come home late and fallen asleep somewhere. The bedding was undisturbed. His backpack was gone. A very slight feeling of unease passed through her, but she dismissed it, as Brian often changed his plans at the last minute. The Lucas Reed household began the morning with a quiet anticipation. His father opened the front door and looked down the deserted street. He stood there longer than necessary, as if he thought that if he lingered any longer, Lucas would appear at the end of the street, backpack slung over his shoulder, walking slowly as usual. Kevin Doyle's family waited the longest. Kevin was younger than the others. They believed he was with his older brothers and that they would bring him back. That belief made them more patient, but it also made the realization come later and hurt more. As time passed without any calls being answered, confusion began to turn into anxiety. Parents called their children's friends. They called each other. They asked the same question and received the same empty answer. By mid-morning, all four families understood something no one wanted to say. No one knew where the four boys were. At that moment, the real panic began. Not with screams, but with a sudden silence. With glances exchanged over the phone. With the very clear feeling that an ordinary night had passed, taking their children away without explanation. The first call to the police was made around noon. The voice on the other end tried to sound calm, as if simply slowing down would make everything seem normal. On this end, the officer on duty took notes habitually, asked familiar questions, and nodded even though no one could see. In 1988, calls like that weren't uncommon. Teenagers out late, sleeping over at a friend's house, forgetting to call home. Those were the initial assumptions, not out of indifference, but because they were often correct. Police noted that the four boys had been together, had no history of serious trouble, and showed no signs of conflict at home. It all looked more like a delay than a tragedy. For the first few hours, the atmosphere remained calm. Some said the children would probably be home before dinner. Others reassured people not to panic too soon. These words were spoken with good intentions, but with each passing minute, they became more fragile. By late afternoon, when none of the boys had appeared, and the phone continued to ring in vain, the atmosphere began to change. The officers left their desks. They drove along familiar routes. They stopped at the soccer field. They asked anyone who remembered seeing the four boys the night before. And then someone mentioned a shortcut through the forest. From that moment, the assumption about the children staying out late began to lose its credibility. The way questions were phrased changed. The tone of conversation became more subdued. Notes were written more meticulously, no longer merely procedural. For parents, the change is very clear. They sense it not through words, but through the eyes of those in uniform. Through the pauses before answering. Through the way promises are made more slowly and cautiously. That afternoon, the belief that everything would work itself crumbled. It was replaced by a deeper, heavier worry. The feeling that this was no longer just a late night out. It was a story taking a turn that none of them were prepared to face. The first night of the search began as the sun was setting behind the trees, and anxiety had already spread throughout the town. Without an official call, people came on their own. Firefighters, police, and even civilians who had never participated in a search before. They brought flashlights, thick coats, and a shared feeling that they couldn't sit still any longer. The light from dozens of flashlights cut through the darkness in narrow streaks. Each person went in a different direction, but no one truly wanted to separate. The forest at night was unlike the forest during the day. It was closer, lower, and seemed to listen to every step. Dry leaves slid under shoes. Branches brushed against sleeves. Every small sound made someone's heart jump. They called out each boy's name, over and over again. Daniel, Brian, Lucas, Kevin. The names echoed and bounced back from the tree trunks, distorted, disjointed, as if the forest were responding with its own emptiness. There was no reply, no footsteps running towards them, only a prolonged silence. Some were more familiar with the forest, leading the way along paths they had used for hunting or mushroom picking. Others walked more slowly, carefully, afraid of missing even the slightest sign. Everyone looked down more than up, as if simply bending down long enough would reveal what they were looking for. The deeper we went, the thicker the darkness became. The flashlight only illuminated a few meters ahead. The rest of the forest remained a secret. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt, not just from the weather, but from an unspoken fear. Fear of finding something bad. Fear of finding nothing at all. Near midnight, the search had to be halted. Not because hope had run out, but because continuing would be too dangerous. The terrain was rugged, visibility was poor, and exhaustion was beginning to slow their reflexes. The decision to stop was made in a heavy silence, a compromise with the darkness. When everyone left the forest, no one said they would return the next morning. But everyone knew it. The forest gave them no answer that first night. It just stood there, silently, holding a silence they were not yet ready to confront. The following morning, as the first light faded and grew cold, the search team returned to the forest with renewed hope. This time they had sniffer dogs. These dogs were trained to track human scent, to do what the human eye couldn't. For the families waiting at the edge of the forest, it was the first sign that things were being taken more seriously. The dogs were tracking the scent from where the four boys had last been seen. The soccer field, the gravel, the lingering footsteps from the previous night. They lowered their heads, pulled the leash forward, and moved decisively, as if the path had been marked out long ago. And, as many feared, the smell led straight to a shortcut. The parents followed behind, holding their breath with every step. Each meter into the woods was a meter further away from any preconceived notions of safety. The trail became clearer in the daylight. Narrow, rough, covered in leaves. It looked so familiar, so ordinary, that it was hard to believe it held the answer for the entire town. The dogs continued to move deeper into the woods. Scents overlapped, as if the four boys had walked close together, then switched places. At times, the scent trails separated slightly, then merged again, reflecting the natural movement of a group of friends chatting and walking. Then, suddenly everything came to a standstill. Near a narrow section of the trail, the dogs stopped. They circled around, their heads close to the ground, then returned to their original spot, as if searching for something that had disappeared. The trainer slowed his pace, observing their every subtle reaction. No one spoke. The air thickened for a few seconds of silence. That's the ravine. During the day, the ravine is more clearly visible, but it's still easy to understand why it can deceive anyone at night. The edge of the ground is covered with leaves, the slope is gentle, then suddenly it plunges deep. The dog goes down a short distance, then the scent disappears completely. There are no signs of continuation. There is no scent trail on the other side. Just an empty space where the smell of people ends. For the search team, it was baffling. For the families, it was a blow to the chest. Not because they saw something terrible, but because they saw nothing at all. The scent led here, then vanished, as if the forest had closed itself off, keeping the rest to itself. For the first time, ravine was more than just a geographical detail. It became a big, silent, and ominous question. The following days passed in a state of limbo that was difficult to define. The search didn't stop, but there was no longer a clear sense that it was moving forward. The forest was expanded in sections. New paths were drawn on the map. Different teams entered the forest in different directions, sometimes unaware that the area had already been explored by others. There was enthusiasm, a lot of it. But there was also overlap. Local people familiar with the forest followed their habits. Official forces tried to follow procedures. Information was documented, but not always shared in a timely manner. Some areas were searched 2 or 3 times, and there were deeper, steeper stretches left untouched because they were too dangerous or too difficult to access. With each passing day, hope didn't vanish immediately. It just thinned. Families stood on the edge of the forest, watching groups of people come and go, trying to read their faces for a sign, a nod, an unusual glance. But most of what they received were very slight shakes of the head. Every small clue was picked up and then put down. A scratch on the tree trunk, its cause unclear. Faint footprints in damp soil, not clear enough to confirm anything. A broken branch, perhaps from that night, or perhaps weeks earlier. Each detail was examined closely, then dismissed because nothing could be certain. At night, families return home in quiet exhaustion. During the day, they come back, carrying the same questions and the same helplessness. No one wants to voice the worst, but it's present in every pause between updates. The forest offered no resistance. It offered no help. It simply existed as if every step, every call, every hope was dissolving into a space too vast to hold on to. And as day passed without a clear clue, the most terrifying feeling began to emerge. That perhaps, despite searching so hard, they hadn't yet reached the right place. When the forest offered no answers, the town began to create them. This was common in small places where people knew each other too well, and the information gap became unbearable. Rumors didn't spread loudly, but seeped in through whispered conversations, over kitchen counters, and through averted glances. Some people said they saw car headlights near the edge of the forest that night. The lights didn't look like those of the locals, brighter, slower. Then they disappeared. Others said they heard a scream, very short, very distant, but weren't sure if it was a human voice or just the sounds of the forest at night. These stories were retold with increasing certainty each time they were passed on, though their origins became increasingly obscure. The police were forced to listen to everything. Every account, however contradictory, was recorded. But not every story could withstand the scrutiny of verification. Time, distance, and fear distorted memories. What began as a vague feeling was gradually recounted as a nearly complete truth. Among those under suspicion was a man who lived a quiet life on the outskirts of town. He didn't cause any major trouble, just was different. He was taciturn. He often went into the woods alone. That was enough for his name to be mentioned. His house was searched. His daily routines were scrutinized. His nocturnal movements were pieced together into a story he himself didn't recognize. For families, every rumor is a double-edged sword. It carries the hope that someone knows something, but it also brings the fear that their child has met the worst. Each new name that emerges ignites emotions, only to leave behind an emptiness when nothing is proven. Eventually, the doubts faded away. There were no reliable witnesses, no physical evidence, no thread connecting the story to the four boys. But the rumors didn't disappear immediately. They left a rift in the town, causing people to look at each other differently, and prolonging the family's pain with theories that would never come true. There was a truth that was rarely spoken of at the time, but it quietly governed the entire search. 1988 was not the world of technology. There were no tools that are taken for granted today. No way to see through the earth. No three-dimensional maps of the terrain, and DNA, which could answer even the smallest questions, was still beyond the reach of most small police departments. The searchers had only what humans always have: eyes, hands, intuition, and perseverance. They walked step by step through the forest, scrutinizing every bush, bending down to examine every patch of earth, believing that if they looked closely enough, the truth would be revealed. But the forest is not a room. It doesn't remain unchanged for humans to examine every corner. The terrain is a silent enemy. Ravines, slopes, dry leaves, soft soil, they all operate in their own way. By day they seem harmless. At night they change, and over time they shift. What the human eye sees in the morning may be different by the afternoon. Today's traces may be erased by tomorrow's rain. Not everyone is willing to admit it. But gradually it's becoming clear. This isn't a quest where humanity lacks effort. This is a quest where humanity is defeated by the terrain. Defeated by things that aren't malicious, but simply don't care. For families, that truth was particularly cruel. They saw how many people went into the woods, how many hours were spent, how many hopes were placed, and yet there were no answers. Not because no one tried, but because the tools of that era were insufficient to reach where the truth lay. In 1988, the forest held the advantage. It held it with darkness, with rocks and soil, with the slow passage of time. And humanity, despite its good intentions and determination, still faced a painful limitation that sometimes the truth was right there, but the time hadn't yet come to see it. In 1991, the case entered a state no family wanted to hear about: cold. No press conferences. No major announcements. Just dwindling phone calls. Searches were no longer mentioned frequently. Updates became shorter, more cautious. For investigators, cold means no new leads. For families, cold means life is hanging in the balance. Not an end. Not a new beginning. But a painful standstill in between. In the four houses, everything continued to exist, but never the same again. There were empty chairs at dinner. No one sat in them. No one dared to remove them. There were rooms that remained unchanged, as if the owners had simply gone somewhere and would return. Time passed, but the furnishings remained the same, because changing them would be like a betrayal. Holidays come and go. Christmas, birthdays, back to school. Occasions that should be filled with laughter are now replaced by prolonged silences. Each time another plate is placed on the table, an unspoken question arises. Will there be a miracle this year? Will the door open? Outside of town, life goes on. Other children grow up. New classes start. People get married, move in, move out. But for those families, time isn't measured in years. It's measured in what should have happened. A graduation ceremony with no one on stage. A birthday that goes uncelebrated. A call that never comes. The files were put away in the filing cabinet, but the waiting didn't. It was in every morning when they woke up, in every evening when they turned off the lights. No one said they had given up hope. But hope now was no longer just an expectation. It had become something smoldering, persistent, and very lonely. While families live in anticipation, the forest continues to do what it always does. It changes slowly and without anyone witnessing it. There are no loud noises, no distinct moments for people to notice. Just the seasons following one another, silently rewriting the landscape in nature's way. The dry leaves of autumn cover the ground, then rot and become part of the soil. Winter comes, the frost causes the earth to contract, then expand again with the arrival of spring. Each cycle blurs the old boundaries a little more. Any traces that once existed, if any, are crushed by time. Then came the years of logging on the edge of the forest. Not mass felling, but selective, legal, controlled operations. But once a few large trees were removed, the light changed, the tree roots loosened, and the soil began to shift in ways no one recorded. The familiar slopes began to slide ever so gently, almost imperceptibly to the naked eye. Each heavy rain deepens the ravine a little. The flowing water carries away soil, leaves, and anything else in its path. What was once buried may be pulled deeper down, or conversely, pushed closer to the surface. There are no clear rules, only the patience of nature. No one returns to the forest every day to observe the changes. But it still happens, whether people notice it or not. And it is this slowness that makes the forest such an effective storage place. It doesn't need a lock. It just needs time. For families, the continued silence of the forest is both painful and cruel, because it raises an unacceptable possibility that the truth hasn't disappeared. It's simply been covered by earth, water, and time, long enough for people to believe they've searched everywhere, when perhaps the answer is still very close, just not yet ready to be revealed. The summer of 2014 arrived like any other summer, hot, humid, and seemingly without anything new. Near the old trail, a temporary worker was assigned to clear broken branches after the rain. The job was simple, repetitive, and required little thought. He had done it dozens of times in different forests. Then he saw something that didn't belong there. Between the exposed roots at the edge of the ravine, a piece of grayish-blue fabric was caught. It didn't look like a leaf. It didn't look like bark. It hung there, stiff, as if it had been there for a long time. He stood still for a few seconds, staring, trying to convince himself it was just rubbish. But something wasn't right. Fabric didn't just burrow deep into tree roots like that. He didn't touch it. He just stepped back and informed the supervisor. The initial response was cautious. In the woods, they still found old clothes, tarpaulins, discarded items. But the location made everyone hesitate. Ravine. That name still carried a heavy feeling, even though no one had mentioned it for years. The police were called in the afternoon. The area was cordoned off. Photographs were taken before anyone touched the thing. When the piece of cloth was pulled from the tree roots, it didn't fall gently. It sprang out along with dry soil, decaying leaves, and the smell of time. It was a varsity-style school jacket. The color had faded. The shoulders were torn, the rips uneven, as if they had been violently pulled. The fabric had become stiff from dirt and age, no longer soft like everyday clothes. The shirt was placed in a sealed bag and sent for examination. Initially, no one dared say too much. Too many years had passed. Too many hopes had risen and fallen, until they saw the collar. Inside, beneath the dirt and frayed threads, are hand-embroidered letters, uneven, imperfect, but very personal. The kind of embroidery a mother once did to recognize her child's belongings in a crowd. The old file was reopened. The old photo was placed next to the shirt. The stitching, the small patch on the sleeve, everything matched. The jacket belongs to Daniel Mercer. When Daniel's family was called, no words could be gentle enough. They recognized the shirt immediately, not by logic, but by memory. By details only family members would know. 26 years after that night, at 9:42 p.m., the forest returned something that could be named for the first time. And along with that coat, the story, which seemed to have been dormant, began to stir and come back to life. The discovery of the jacket didn't create a huge uproar. It created a different kind of silence, deeper and heavier. The case was reopened not as a new incident, but as an acknowledgement that something had been overlooked. And now it was time to return, more slowly and carefully. This time, the search was no longer based primarily on intuition. Cadaver dogs were brought in, trained to detect even the slightest traces of human decomposition, even after many years. They worked silently, noses close to the ground, responding to signals that the human eye would never perceive. The ravine was considered the center, no longer a suspicious point in many theories, but the focal point of the entire site. The terrain was remeasured. The slope was recorded. Every small change in the ground was noted. No one considered it a minor detail anymore. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed, even though everyone understood that the rocky and mixed terrain would never yield perfect results. But this time, they had the tools to look below the surface, a place no one had access to 26 years earlier. The blurry images that emerged were indistinct, but enough to reveal areas of unusually structured land. The scene was divided into small squares. Each square was meticulously marked, measured, photographed, and documented. There were no more hurried steps. No more quick assumptions. Every action was carefully considered, because everyone understood this might be their last chance. The atmosphere in the forest was different from previous searches. Fewer people, fewer voices, but each person carried a heavy sense of seriousness. No one spoke aloud, but everyone thought of the families waiting, not waiting for a miracle, but waiting for a truth clear enough to no longer be imagined. As the teams delved deeper into the ravine, the general feeling became clear. The forest was beginning to reveal itself. And this time, no one wanted to turn away before fully listening to what it was trying to say. The early days of the excavation unfolded in near absolute silence. No one spoke of hypotheses anymore. No one debated as before. Everything now revolved around listening to the earth, reading every small clue, and proceeding slowly because a single mistake could erase the rest of the truth. Cadaver dogs react first. Not a dramatic stop like in the movies, but small, repeated signals. Nose lowered, a circle around. Focused attention on a particular area. The dispatcher marks the spot. The forensic team brings in ground-penetrating radar to check. Anomalies appear on the screen, indistinct, but enough to allow for deeper digging. As the layers of decaying leaves and compacted earth are gradually peeled away, what is revealed doesn't come as a sight. It comes as a choking sensation. A small fragment, a curve of bone, a silent sign that a human being once lay here for a very long time. The first remains were confirmed to belong to Brian Holloway. The identification wasn't stated with absolute certainty immediately. Experts used cautious language, match, consistency, likely, until the dental records were compared, and the answer became undeniable. The news reached Brian's family quietly. Just a phone call, a short statement, and a long silence on the other end of the line. To an outsider, one might think that after 26 years, the pain would have subsided. But it hadn't. It had simply lain dormant, waiting for something to touch it, only to flare up again just like the first day. Nearby, the teams continued their search of the site. They found more fragments of material, fabric fibers, and shoe soles that had been deformed over time. The evidence suggested that water had seeped in, soil had filled in, and the movement of ravines over the seasons had dispersed everything. Confirmation took longer, as time had taken its toll. But eventually, the results came. Kevin Doyle was there too. For Kevin's family, the most painful thing wasn't just the loss of their son. It was the image of a 15-year-old boy, following his older brothers out of trust, a desire to belong, and the belief that being together would keep them safe. At that age, the truth becomes sharper, like a cutting wound. Then they found Luca's reed. But Luca's wasn't lying right next to the other two. Lucas's remains were discovered further and deeper along the ravine, in an area showing signs of sedimentation, as if the earth and water had carried the debris over the years. That distance silenced the entire investigative team, because it raised a possibility no one wanted to consider, but could not be ignored. The forensic experts maintained cautious language. They didn't speak definitively about the minute-by-minute sequence of events that night. But they explained what the data allowed: location, the degree of dispersion, the type of injuries still discernible, all consistent with an accident involving steep terrain and a fall. And in Lucas's case specifically, the greater distance could suggest he had moved after the initial incident or been affected by environmental factors over time. Just one sentence like that was enough to weigh heavily on the listener's heart. Because if Lucas had ever tried to crawl, tried to find his way, tried to survive a little longer in that dark and cold ravine, then it was a very human tragedy. Not the kind of tragedy with a villain, but the tragedy of instinct, of panic, of a body trying to do the last thing it knew how to do. When the three names were confirmed, the town was no longer a place searching for a mystery. It became a place receiving the truth. And that truth, though not sensational, was cruel in a different way. It made people realize that sometimes the most terrible thing isn't an evil deed. It's a wrong step, in the darkness, in a place where no one can see. Daniel Mercer was the name mentioned most often throughout the search, and also the name that silenced everyone the longest. Because the jacket had appeared. Because the tracks indicated he was right at the edge of the ravine. because if anyone had tried to hold the others back in the first moment, it was most likely Daniel. But it took weeks, then months of investigation, before Daniel's presence was confirmed. His remains were found further along the ravine, more far than the initial investigation teams had predicted. The terrain there was more complex. Evidence indicated that the soil and water had shifted over the years. What remained was little, scattered by time, by rain, by countless passing seasons. But every small detail was carefully examined. Dental records bring an end to the wait. When the news reached Daniel's family, there were no more outbursts of grief like 26 years earlier. Just a long, drawn-out silence. The silence of those who had lived too long in a state of unresolved pain. For them, the pain wasn't new. What was new was that it finally took shape. Daniel was the last to be found. But he wasn't the one left behind. Quite the opposite. His discovery closed a circle that had begun at 9:42 p.m. 4 boys. 4 names. No one was left hanging in the balance with unanswered questions. For the families, that moment didn't bring complete relief. There was no sense of victory, only one very human feeling. The wait was finally over. They no longer had to wonder every night where their children were, how they were, or if they had been left alone. 4 boys ventured into the woods together. And nearly 3 decades later, they are brought out of the story of their disappearance together. Not as an unsolved mystery, but as people who have been called by name, found in the right place, and finally, no longer forgotten in the silence of the forest. When all the evidence had been pieced together, the investigators presented their conclusions in the most cautious language they could. There were no definitive statements to ease the pain. Only carefully considered words, reflecting only what the truth allowed to be said. What happened that night was determined to be a chain reaction accident. It began with something very small, in a seemingly harmless place, a misplaced footstep, a soft, uneven edge of ground. In the darkness, with dry leaves obscuring the view and the slope obscured, just a moment of imbalance was enough for everything to spiral out of control. Ravine is not a clear cliff, it's a visual trap. By day, people can judge the distance. At night, all depth is blurred. When someone falls, the natural reflex of the others is to rush to help. But each step forward weakens the edge of the cliff. And the accidents don't stop with the first person. Darkness speeds things up. It shortens reaction time. It disorients. In seconds, a potentially salvageable situation becomes an irreversible chain of events. There is no malice, no conflict. Just a combination of terrain, timing, and human limitations. The final, and most cruel, factor was the delay in discovery. If there had been light, if someone had seen it immediately, if a call had been heard in time, the outcome might have been different. But in that forest night, no one knew what was happening. And by the time the sun rose, everything had been covered by earth, water, and time. That conclusion offered no comfort. It gave no one an object of anger. But it put things back in their proper place. A tragedy that didn't require crime. A series of very human decisions, met with uncompromising circumstances. And sometimes, the most painful truth is this: that not all losses come from evil. There are losses that come from a very short, very ordinary moment, but are enough to change the lives of many people forever. After all, this story doesn't end with a villain being brought to justice. It ends with the realization, slow and heavy, that sometimes tragedy doesn't need conspiracy or malice. It just needs a familiar shortcut, a dark night, and a moment of carelessness. Shortcuts always promise to save time. They offer a sense of convenience, a feeling that we've taken this path countless times without fail. But this very familiarity sometimes makes us forget that the world doesn't change to suit human beliefs. The terrain doesn't remember footsteps. Darkness doesn't yield to experience. And time doesn't turn back to correct a decision that has already passed. The 4 boys entered the forest with a youthful belief. Belief in the path. Belief in each other. Belief that together everything would be all right. And that's what makes this story resonate with so many people. Because in everyone's life, we've all chosen a shortcut at some point. Not just on the road, but in seemingly small daily decisions. If you're one of those who followed this story to the very end, pause for a moment and ask yourself which is scarier. An unsolved mystery, or a truth so commonplace, so ordinary, that it makes us realize the same thing could happen to anyone. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Not to argue, but so that the people in this story will be remembered, not just as an incident, but as lives that once existed and were loved. And if you believe that stories need to be told slowly, kindly, with people at the center, then subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber not only helps the video spread, but also ensures that these memories will never be forgotten again.